The smoky haze of Murphy's bar hung thick in the air as Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison pushed through the crowded entrance.
I
The
won't
familiar
tolerate
smell of stale beer and
But
fried
that's
food
not
greeted him
fair.
like an old friend. After 18 months deployed in Afghanistan, this rundown establishment 3 blocks from Camp Pendleton felt like paradise. The neon Budweiser sign flickered overhead, casting red shadows across the weathered faces of Marines who had made this place their second home. Jake's combat boots echoed against the sticky floor as he made his way to the bar. His dress blues hung perfectly on his broad frame, ribbons and medals catching the dim light. Tonight was special. He had just received word of his promotion to gunnery sergeant. The news called for celebration, and Murphy's was where Marines came to celebrate. The bartender, a grizzled former Marine named Tommy, recognized Jake immediately. Without being asked, he slid a cold beer across the scarred wooden bar. Jake nodded his thanks and took a long drink, letting the bitter liquid wash away the stress of the day. Around him, conversations flowed in the familiar cadence of military life, talk of deployments, training exercises, and the endless bureaucracy that defined their existence. As Jake surveyed the crowded room, his eyes fell on a woman sitting alone at a corner table. She was stunning, shoulder-length auburn hair framed a face that belonged in magazines rather than military bars. Her simple black dress and understated jewelry suggested sophistication far beyond the usual crowd at Murphy's. She sat with perfect posture, occasionally sipping from a glass of red wine while scrolling through her phone with focused attention. Something about her presence intrigued Jake. In his experience, women who looked like that didn't frequent dive bars near military bases unless they were looking for trouble or looking for Marines. Either way, he was interested. The alcohol flowing through his system boosted his confidence as he straightened his uniform and checked his appearance in the mirror behind the bar. Jake had always been successful with women. His rugged good looks, combined with the uniform and his easy charm, had rarely failed him. During his deployment, he had dreamed of moments like this, returning home to American bars filled with beautiful women who appreciated heroes in uniform. Tonight felt like the perfect opportunity to remind himself what he had been fighting for. Without hesitation, Jake grabbed his beer and approached her table. The woman looked up as his shadow fell across her phone screen. Her eyes were a striking green, intelligent and alert. For a moment, Jake felt a flicker of uncertainty, but he pushed it aside. Confidence was everything in situations like this. "Evening, beautiful," Jake said, flashing his most charming smile. "Mind if I join you? A woman as stunning as you shouldn't be drinking alone." The woman's expression remained neutral as she looked him up and down. Her gaze lingered on his ribbons and rank insignia with what seemed like professional interest rather than romantic attraction. When she spoke, her voice was calm and measured. "Thank you for the compliment, but I prefer to drink alone tonight." Jake's smile widened. He had encountered resistance before. It was part of the game. In his experience, initial rejection was often just testing his persistence. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down uninvited. "Come on now, don't be like that. I just got back from Afghanistan, and I could really use some company. Besides, I'm celebrating a promotion tonight. Surely you wouldn't deny a Marine the chance to share his good news with a beautiful woman?" The woman set down her wineglass with deliberate precision. Her green eyes hardened slightly, but her voice remained controlled. "Congratulations on your promotion, Sergeant. However, I asked you politely to leave me alone. I would appreciate it if you would respect that request." Jake noticed she had correctly identified his rank, which impressed him. Most civilians couldn't read military insignia. But her continued resistance only fueled his determination. The alcohol was making him bolder, and the watching eyes of other Marines in the bar made backing down feel impossible. "You know, most women would be honored to have a drink with a decorated Marine," Jake said, his tone becoming slightly more aggressive. "I've risked my life defending this country and women like you. The least you could do is show a little appreciation." The temperature at the table seemed to drop several degrees. Other patrons were beginning to notice the interaction, and conversations at nearby tables quieted. The woman's posture remained perfectly straight, but something dangerous flickered in her eyes. "I appreciate your service to our country," she said carefully. But, your military service doesn't entitle you to my time or attention. I'm asking you one more time to leave me alone. Jake felt heat rising in his cheeks. The combination of alcohol, wounded pride, and the audience of fellow Marines was clouding his judgment. He had never been rejected so coldly, and it stung more than he cared to admit. What's your problem, lady? I'm trying to be nice here. You're sitting in a military bar, what did you expect? Maybe you should find somewhere else to drink if you don't want Marines talking to you. The woman's phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen, and, for the first time, Jake saw something like satisfaction cross her features. She looked back at him with an expression that was somehow both patient and predatory. Actually, Sergeant Morrison, she said, using his name for the first time, I think you're the one who should be concerned about where you choose to drink and how you choose to behave. Jake froze. He hadn't told her his name, and his name tag was obscured by the angle at which he sat. A cold feeling began to creep up his spine, but his alcohol-fueled bravado kept him in his seat. How do you know my name? He demanded. Before she could answer, Jake's phone rang. The caller ID showed his commanding officer's number. With growing unease, he answered the call. Staff Sergeant Morrison speaking, sir. Morrison, where are you right now? The voice of Lieutenant Colonel Harrison was sharp and urgent. I'm at Murphy's bar, sir. Why do you ask? Listen to me very carefully, Morrison. I need you to stop whatever you're doing and return to base immediately. There's been a development that requires your immediate attention. Jake looked across the table at the woman, who was now watching him with obvious interest. Something in her expression made his stomach drop. Sir, what kind of development? Just get back here now, Morrison. And, for God's sake, try not to make the situation any worse than it already is. The line went dead. Jake stared at his phone, his mind racing. When he looked up, the woman was standing, gathering her purse and phone. She moved with military precision, and Jake suddenly noticed details he had missed before: her perfect posture, the confident way she carried herself, the subtle authority in her bearing. Who are you? Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman smiled for the first time since he had approached her table. It was not a warm smile. Someone who has been very interested in your behavior tonight, Sergeant Morrison. I suggest you follow your commanding officer's advice and return to base. Something tells me you're going to need all the help you can get. She turned and walked toward the exit, leaving Jake sitting alone at the table with his half-empty beer and a growing sense of dread. Around him, the normal sounds of the bar continued, but everything felt different now. The celebration he had planned was over before it had really begun, and he had the terrible feeling that his problems were just getting started. As Jake finally stood to leave, Tommy the bartender caught his eye and shook his head sadly. Jake, my boy, Tommy said quietly, I think you just made the biggest mistake of your military career. The words echoed in Jake's mind as he walked out into the cool California night, his dress blue suddenly feeling like a costume rather than a symbol of honor. Behind him, Murphy's bar continued its nightly rhythm, but Jake Morrison's world had just shifted in ways he was only beginning to understand. The drive back to Camp Pendleton felt like the longest 20 minutes of Jake's life. His mind replayed every moment of the encounter, searching for clues he might have missed. The woman's calm confidence, her knowledge of military protocol, the way she had said his name with such certainty, it all pointed to something he didn't want to acknowledge. As he approached the main gate of the base, the guards waved him through with unusual speed. Even in the darkness, Jake could see lights on in buildings that should have been empty at this hour. Something was definitely wrong, and he was at the center of it. The walk from the parking lot to Lieutenant Colonel Harrison's office felt like a death march. Jake's footsteps echoed in the empty corridors, each sound reminding him that normal people were home with their families while he was about to face whatever consequences awaited him. When he knocked on Harrison's door, the response was immediate. Enter. Jake stepped into the office and immediately snapped to attention. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison sat behind his desk, but he wasn't alone. Two other officers sat in chairs facing the desk, officers Jake didn't recognize but whose rank insignia indicated they significantly outranked everyone else in the room. Staff Sergeant Morrison reporting as ordered, sir. Harrison looked up from a file on his desk. His expression was grave. Morrison, I'm going to ask you a very simple question, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer. Did you have an interaction tonight with a woman at Murphy's bar? Jake's mouth went dry. Yes, sir. And how would you characterize that interaction? The two unknown officers were watching Jake with intense interest. He could feel sweat beginning to form under his uniform. I approached her table and attempted to strike up a conversation, sir. She seemed uninterested, so I left. One of the unknown officers leaned forward. His voice was cold when he spoke. Sergeant Morrison, are you familiar with the concept of sexual harassment? The question hit Jake like a physical blow. Sir, I never harassed anyone. I was just trying to be friendly. Harrison opened the file on his desk and began reading. According to the report I've received, you approached this woman uninvited, ignored her repeated requests to leave her alone, made inappropriate comments about her appearance, and suggested that your military service entitled you to her attention. Is this accurate? Jake felt the walls closing in around him. Sir, it wasn't like that. I was just trying to have a conversation. I had been drinking, and maybe I was a little persistent, but I never meant any harm. The second unknown officer spoke for the first time. Sergeant Morrison, do you have any idea who you were speaking to tonight? The question Jake had been dreading finally came. He looked from one officer to another, seeing his career flashing before his eyes. No, sir. She never told me her name. Harrison closed the file and leaned back in his chair. Sergeant Morrison, meet Colonel Patricia Hawkins and Brigadier General Robert Chen from Marine Corps Headquarters. They're here because the woman you harassed tonight has filed a formal complaint. Jake felt like he might be sick. A formal complaint meant an investigation, which meant his promotion was in jeopardy, which meant his entire career was at risk. Sir, if I could speak to her and apologize. That won't be possible, General Chen interrupted. And even if it were, I don't think an apology would be sufficient at this point. Harrison stood up and walked around his desk. Morrison, you've always been a good Marine. Your service record is exemplary, your leadership skills are strong, and your men respect you. That's why what happened tonight is so disappointing. We expect better from our non-commissioned officers. Jake straightened his shoulders, trying to maintain some dignity in the face of disaster. Sir, I take full responsibility for my actions. If there's anything I can do to make this right. The woman in question, Colonel Hawkins said quietly, has specifically requested that you not contact her in any way. Any attempt to do so would be considered harassment and would result in immediate disciplinary action. The room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Jake stared at the floor, trying to process the magnitude of his situation. One conversation, one night of poor judgment, and everything he had worked for was at risk. What happens now? Jake asked. General Chen stood up, and Jake automatically came to attention. Now, Sergeant Morrison, you wait. There will be a formal investigation, during which time you will continue your duties but will be restricted from any leadership positions. The outcome of that investigation will determine your future in the Marine Corps. As the general and colonel prepared to leave, Harrison placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. Jake, I've known you for 5 years. This isn't like you. What happened tonight? Jake thought about the question. What had happened? He had approached an attractive woman in a bar and been rejected. Instead of accepting that rejection gracefully, he had pressed forward, fueled by alcohol and wounded pride. It seemed so trivial when he thought about it that way, but the consequences were anything but trivial. I don't know, sir. I made some bad choices, and now I have to live with them. Harrison nodded sadly. Yes, you do. Go home, get some sleep, and report for duty tomorrow morning. And, Jake? Think very carefully about how you want to handle this situation going forward. Your career isn't over yet, but it's hanging by a thread. As Jake walked out of the office and into the cool night air, he realized that everything he thought he knew about his life had just changed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and he had no idea how to face them. The confident Marine who had walked into Murphy's bar a few hours earlier was gone, replaced by someone who was learning the hard way that actions have consequences, regardless of the uniform you wear. The next morning arrived with the cruel brightness of California sunshine streaming through Jake's barracks window. He had managed only 3 hours of restless sleep, his mind replaying the previous night's events in an endless loop. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the woman's green eyes and that final, knowing smile. The sound of his alarm felt like a judgment bell, calling him to face whatever consequences awaited. Jake's morning routine felt mechanical and strange. The simple acts of showering, shaving, and putting on his uniform carried new weight. Each ribbon on his chest, each crease in his trousers, reminded him of the years of service that were now in jeopardy. As he looked in the mirror, he barely recognized the uncertain man staring back at him. The walk to the company office was a gauntlet of curious stares from fellow Marines. Word traveled fast in military communities, and Jake could feel the weight of whispered conversations and knowing looks. Some faces showed sympathy, others showed judgment, but most showed the careful neutrality of people who didn't want to be associated with potential scandal. Staff Sergeant Kelly Rodriguez intercepted Jake before he could reach the company office. Kelly was one of his closest friends on base, a fellow non-commissioned officer who had served alongside him in Afghanistan. Her expression was serious as she pulled him aside. "Jake, what the hell happened last night?" she asked in a low voice. "The entire base is buzzing with rumors, and none of them are good." Jake looked around to make sure they weren't being overheard before responding. "I made a mistake, Kelly. A big one. I approached a woman at Murphy's, and, when she wasn't interested, I didn't handle it well." Kelly's eyes narrowed. "How badly did you not handle it?" "Bad enough that she filed a formal complaint. Bad enough that there are officers from headquarters asking questions. Bad enough that my career might be over." Kelly whistled softly. "Jake, you're one of the smartest Marines I know. How could you let something like this happen?" The question cut deep because Jake had been asking himself the same thing all night. How had he gone from celebrating a promotion to facing potential discharge in a single evening? "I don't know," Jake admitted. "I had been drinking, I was feeling confident, and, when she rejected me, my pride took over. I said things I shouldn't have said and did things I shouldn't have done." Before Kelly could respond, First Sergeant Martinez appeared in the doorway of the company office. "Morrison. My office, now." Jake exchanged a quick look with Kelly before following the first sergeant inside. Martinez was a career Marine with 22 years of service and a reputation for being tough but fair. His office was spartanly decorated with military awards and photographs from various deployments. "Close the door and have a seat," Martinez said without looking up from paperwork on his desk. Jake closed the door and sat in the chair across from Martinez's desk. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Martinez finally looked up. "Morrison, in 22 years of service, I've seen Marines make every kind of mistake you can imagine. Some mistakes can be fixed with extra duty or a reduction in rank. Others end careers. Based on what I'm hearing about last night, yours might be the latter." Jake felt his stomach drop. "First Sergeant, I know I made a mistake, but," Martinez held up a hand to stop him. "Don't explain it to me, Morrison. I wasn't there, and my opinion doesn't matter. What matters is that there's going to be an investigation, and, during that investigation, every aspect of your military career is going to be examined under a microscope." Martinez opened a file cabinet and pulled out a thick folder. "This is your personnel file. 18 years of service, multiple combat deployments, commendations for leadership and valor. Up until last night, you were exactly the kind of Marine we want leading our young troops." The first sergeant set the file on his desk and leaned forward. "But, here's the thing about careers built on reputation, Morrison. They can be destroyed in a single moment of poor judgment. And, unfortunately for you, your moment happened in front of someone who has the power to make sure the consequences stick." Jake's throat felt dry. "First Sergeant, who was she?" Martinez studied Jake's face carefully before responding. "That's not information I'm authorized to share." What I can tell you is that your situation has attracted attention from very high levels of command. Higher than base level, higher than district level. The implications hit Jake like a physical blow. If the attention was coming from that high up the chain of command, the woman he had encountered wasn't just any civilian. She was someone with serious connections, serious authority, or both. What do I do now? Jake asked. Now you do exactly what you're told, when you're told to do it. You show up for duty every day with the proper uniform and the proper attitude. You don't discuss this incident with anyone except your lawyer and the investigating officers. And you pray that whoever you offended last night is feeling merciful. Martinez stood up, signaling the end of their conversation. Morrison, you've been reassigned to administrative duties pending the outcome of the investigation. Report to the base personnel office. They'll give you your new assignment. As Jake walked across the base toward the personnel office, he felt like everyone was watching him. Fellow Marines who had previously greeted him with respect now looked away or offered only the most minimal acknowledgments. The invisible weight of military hierarchy was pressing down on him, and he was learning what it felt like to be on the wrong side of it. The personnel office was a bureaucratic maze of file cabinets and computer terminals. Jake reported to the duty officer, a young lieutenant who looked uncomfortable as he explained Jake's new assignment. Sergeant Morrison, you've been assigned to file maintenance and record keeping. Your supervisor will be Staff Sergeant Thompson in the archives section. Jake knew Staff Sergeant Thompson by reputation, a career administrator who took pride in maintaining perfect records. Being assigned to work under Thompson was clearly intended as both punishment and humiliation. Administrative duties were typically assigned to Marines who were either being disciplined or who lacked the qualifications for more significant responsibilities. The archives section was located in the basement of the administration building, a fluorescent-lit maze of file cabinets and storage boxes that felt more like a tomb than a workplace. Thompson greeted Jake with professional courtesy but obvious discomfort. Sergeant Morrison, I want you to understand that I didn't request this assignment, and I'm not entirely comfortable supervising someone who's under investigation. However, orders are orders, and we'll make the best of the situation. Thompson handed Jake a stack of files and pointed toward a corner desk. Your job is to review these personnel files for accuracy and completeness. Check service records, awards, disciplinary actions, medical records, everything needs to be verified against the original documentation. It's detail work, but it's important. Jake sat at the assigned desk and opened the first file. The work was mind-numbing and felt like punishment, which he supposed was the point. As he worked, he couldn't help but think about his own file and what investigators would find when they reviewed every detail of his 18-year career. Around noon, Jake's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Sergeant Morrison, this is Captain Jennifer Walsh, your appointed legal counsel. Please report to Building 243, Room 15, at 1,400 hours today for an initial consultation. Jake had never needed a military lawyer before. The fact that one had been appointed for him drove home the seriousness of his situation. He showed the text to Thompson, who nodded and waved him away. Building 243 housed the base legal offices, and Room 15 turned out to be a small, windowless conference room where Captain Walsh was waiting for him. She was a sharp-looking woman in her early 30s with intelligent eyes and an air of professional competence. Sergeant Morrison, please have a seat. I've been appointed as your legal counsel for the investigation into last night's incident. Jake sat down and tried to read Walsh's expression. Captain, how serious is this situation? Walsh opened a legal pad and uncapped a pen. That depends on several factors, including the exact nature of your actions last night and the identity of the person filing the complaint. Before we discuss strategy, I need you to tell me exactly what happened, and I mean exactly. Don't leave out any details, don't minimize your actions, and don't try to make yourself look better than you were. Jake took a deep breath and began recounting the events at Murphy's bar. As he spoke, Walsh took detailed notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When he finished, she set down her pen and looked at him seriously. Sergeant Morrison, you're facing potential charges under Article 134 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. The penalties can range from reduction in rank to discharge from service. Jake felt the blood drain from his face. Captain, is there any way to resolve this without a court-martial? That depends on factors that are currently beyond our control. The investigation will determine the exact charges, if any, that will be filed. What I can tell you is that your best chance for a favorable outcome is complete cooperation and genuine remorse for your actions. Walsh closed her legal pad and leaned forward. Sergeant Morrison, I've handled cases like this before. The military takes sexual harassment very seriously, especially in the current climate. Your service record will help, but it won't save you if the evidence shows a pattern of inappropriate behavior. Jake's mind raced. A pattern? Captain, I've never done anything like this before. Last night was completely out of character for me. That's good to hear, but the investigating officers will verify that claim. They'll interview people who know you, review your entire service history, and look for any previous incidents or complaints. The weight of scrutiny was becoming overwhelming. Jake realized that his entire military career was about to be dissected by people looking for evidence of misconduct. What should I do while the investigation is ongoing? Keep your head down, do your assigned duties without complaint, and absolutely do not try to contact or investigate the complainant. Any attempt to identify her or interfere with her statement will be seen as intimidation and will make your situation much worse. As Jake left the legal office, he felt like he was walking through a nightmare. 24 hours ago, he had been celebrating a promotion and looking forward to the next phase of his career. Now he was facing the possibility of losing everything he had worked for over the course of 18 years. The afternoon dragged by as Jake returned to his filing duties. Each document he reviewed reminded him of the life and career that was now in jeopardy. Service records, award citations, performance evaluations, all the building blocks of a military career that could be destroyed by a single night of poor judgment. As the duty day ended, Jake walked slowly back to his barracks room. The base around him buzzed with normal activity, Marines heading to evening chow, physical training sessions, social gatherings. Life was continuing normally for everyone except him. Back in his room, Jake sat on his bunk and stared at his reflection in the mirror across the room. The man looking back at him seemed like a stranger, someone who had made choices that the Jake Morrison of a week ago would never have made. His phone rang, displaying his sister's number. Sarah Morrison was a teacher in Ohio, the only family member who kept in regular contact. Jake considered not answering, but he knew Sarah would worry if he didn't respond. "Hey, sis," he said, trying to keep his voice normal. "Jake. How's military life treating my favorite Marine?" The innocent question hit harder than Sarah could have known. Jake closed his eyes and tried to decide how much to tell her. "It's been a challenging week," he said finally. "Challenging how? Is everything okay?" Jake wanted desperately to tell someone about what was happening, but he knew that discussing the case could make things worse. "Just some work stuff. Nothing I can't handle." Sarah's voice took on the concerned tone she had used when they were children, and she was worried about him. "Jake, you don't sound like yourself. Are you sure you're okay?" For a moment, Jake considered telling her everything. Sarah had always been his closest confidant, the person he turned to when life became complicated. But this situation was too serious, too dangerous to share with a civilian family member. "I'm fine, Sarah. Just tired. How are things with you and the kids?" Sarah launched into stories about her teaching job and her children, and Jake listened gratefully to the normalcy of her life. For a few minutes, he could pretend that his own life wasn't falling apart. After ending the call, Jake sat in the growing darkness of his room and thought about the choices that had brought him to this point. Tomorrow would bring another day of administrative duties and legal consultations, another day of waiting to learn his fate. The woman from the bar remained a mystery, but Jake was beginning to understand that solving that mystery wasn't his biggest problem. His biggest problem was accepting responsibility for his actions and finding a way to salvage what remained of his military career. As he finally drifted off to sleep, Jake's last conscious thought was a prayer that he would somehow find a way to make things right, even though he was beginning to suspect that the opportunity for redemption might be beyond his reach. 3 days passed in a blur of administrative monotony and growing anxiety. Jake's new routine consisted of filing paperwork, avoiding eye contact with fellow Marines, and meeting with Captain Walsh to discuss legal strategy. The investigation was proceeding, but information was scarce. Walsh had managed to learn that the investigating officers were conducting interviews with Marines who had been at Murphy's bar that night, but beyond that, details were limited. On Thursday morning, Jake was sorting through a stack of medical records when Staff Sergeant Thompson approached his desk with an unusual expression on his face. "Morrison, you have visitors. Conference room B, immediately." Jake felt his stomach lurch. Unscheduled visits from investigators were never good news. He followed Thompson down the hallway to a small conference room where 2 people in civilian clothes were waiting for him. "Sergeant Morrison, I'm Special Agent Rebecca Torres from the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, and this is Special Agent Michael Park. Please have a seat." Jake sat down carefully, his mind racing. NCIS involvement meant this had escalated far beyond a simple base-level investigation. Federal agents only became involved in the most serious cases. Agent Torres opened a laptop computer and positioned it so Jake could see the screen. "Sergeant Morrison, we're going to show you some security camera footage from Murphy's bar. We want you to watch it carefully and, then, tell us if your recollection of Tuesday night's events matches what we see here." Jake's mouth went dry as the black and white footage began to play. The camera angle was from behind the bar, showing a clear view of the seating area. Jake watched himself enter the frame and approach the woman's table, his body language confident and aggressive. The footage had no audio, but Jake could remember every word of the conversation as he watched his past self lean over the table, ignore the woman's obvious discomfort, and continue talking despite her clear attempts to end the interaction. From this perspective, his behavior looked even worse than it had felt in the moment. "This footage shows approximately 8 minutes of interaction," Agent Park said as the video continued. "During that time, the woman asked you to leave her alone multiple times, but you remained at her table. Is that an accurate assessment?" Jake watched the final moments of the encounter, seeing himself stand up angrily before the woman rose and left the bar. His own body language looked threatening and aggressive. "Yes, sir. That's accurate." Agent Torres paused the video and turned the laptop toward herself. "Sergeant Morrison, during the course of this investigation, we've learned some additional information that we believe you should know. The woman you approached that night is Rear Admiral Catherine Wells, Deputy Commander of Marine Corps Training and Education Command." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. Rear Admiral. A 2-star flag officer, one of the highest-ranking women in the Marine Corps. Jake felt like the world was tilting around him. "Sir, I had no idea that she was a flag officer," Agent Park finished. "We understand that. However, Admiral Wells was off duty and dressed in civilian clothes. She had every right to expect that she could have a drink in a public establishment without being harassed by subordinate service members." Jake's mind was reeling. A Rear Admiral. He had harassed a Rear Admiral. The magnitude of his mistake was becoming clear, and it was worse than anything he had imagined. Agent Torres leaned forward. "Sergeant Morrison, Admiral Wells initially planned to handle this matter informally. She believed that a conversation with your commanding officer would be sufficient to address the incident. However, when she learned that you had a pattern of similar behavior, she decided to file a formal complaint." Jake's confusion was immediate and overwhelming. "A pattern? What pattern? I've never done anything like this before." The agents exchanged glances before Agent Park opened a folder. "During our investigation, we interviewed several people who know you. 3 female Marines reported incidents of inappropriate comments or unwelcome advances over the past 2 years. Additionally, 2 civilian employees on base reported feeling uncomfortable with your behavior during social interactions." Jake felt like he was drowning. The accusations were devastating, not just because of their implications for his case, but because he genuinely couldn't remember the incidents they were describing. "I don't understand. Can you be more specific about these allegations?" Agent Torres read from a report. Lance Corporal Jennifer Kim stated that you made persistent comments about her appearance during a unit social event last year and asked her out multiple times despite her clear lack of interest. Corporal Lisa Rodriguez reported that you cornered her in the mess hall and made inappropriate comments about her body. Base Library employee Maria Santos stated that you made her uncomfortable with repeated visits that seemed unrelated to library services. Each allegation felt like a punch to the gut. Jake remembered the interactions differently: casual flirtations, friendly conversation, normal social interaction. But hearing them described from the women's perspectives painted a completely different picture. "I never intended to make anyone uncomfortable," Jake said quietly. "I thought I was just being friendly." "Intent matters," Sergeant Morrison, Agent Park said, "but impact matters more. These women felt harassed by your behavior, regardless of your intentions." Agent Torres closed the folder and looked directly at Jake. "Sergeant Morrison, we want you to understand the gravity of your situation. You're facing potential court-martial for sexual harassment of a flag officer, and these additional allegations establish a pattern of misconduct that will influence both the charges and the potential penalties." Jake stared at the table, trying to process everything he was hearing. His career was over, that much was clear now. But beyond his professional life, he was beginning to question everything he thought he knew about himself. "What happens next?" Jake asked. "Next, you'll be formally charged under Article 120 of the UCMJ for sexual harassment and Article 134 for conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. Your case will proceed to a general court-martial, where you'll face a panel of officers who will determine your guilt or innocence." The formal charges felt like a death sentence. Jake had attended courts-martial before, usually as a character witness for other Marines. He knew how the process worked, and he knew that defendants rarely emerged with their careers intact. After the agents left, Jake sat alone in the conference room for several minutes, trying to comprehend the destruction of everything he had built over 18 years of service. When he finally returned to his desk, Thompson was waiting for him. "Morrison, you're wanted in the company commander's office." Captain David Rodriguez was a combat veteran with 12 years of service and a reputation for being fair but demanding. Jake had served under him for 2 years and had always maintained a good relationship with him. Today, however, Rodriguez's expression was grave. "Morrison, close the door and have a seat." Jake complied and waited for Rodriguez to speak. "I've just been briefed on the charges being brought against you. I have to tell you, I'm shocked and disappointed. In the 2 years you've worked for me, I never saw any indication of the behavior you're being accused of." Jake appreciated the captain's support, but he could hear the past tense in Rodriguez's words. The relationship between them had already changed. "Sir, I made a terrible mistake at Murphy's Bar, but some of these other allegations, I remember those situations differently." Rodriguez held up a hand to stop him. "Morrison, I'm not the person you need to convince. My job now is to ensure that this unit continues to function effectively while your case proceeds through the legal system." The captain opened a file on his desk. "Effective immediately, you're being transferred to Special Processing Company pending the outcome of your court-martial. You'll report there tomorrow morning for assignment to administrative duties." Jake knew about Special Processing Company. It was where the Marine Corps kept personnel who were awaiting legal proceedings, medical discharge, or other administrative actions. Being assigned there was a clear signal that his time as a regular Marine was over. "Sir, is there any possibility that I could remain with the unit? I'd like to continue serving with Marines I know and respect." Rodriguez's expression softened slightly. "Morrison, I wish that were possible, but your presence here is disruptive to unit cohesion. The Marines under your supervision are questioning their confidence in the leadership, and, frankly, I can't blame them." The truth of that statement was devastating. Jake had always taken pride in the respect he commanded from junior Marines. Learning that his actions had damaged that relationship was almost worse than facing legal consequences. That evening, Jake packed his personal belongings from his office and prepared for the transfer to Special Processing Company. As he gathered his awards and personal items, each object reminded him of a different phase of his career: the combat action ribbon from Iraq, the good conduct medals from years of exemplary service, the leadership awards from various training assignments. Kelly Rodriguez appeared in his doorway as he was finishing packing. "Jake, I heard about the transfer. I'm sorry this is happening to you." Jake looked up from the box he was packing. "Kelly, can I ask you something? In all the years we've known each other, have I ever made you uncomfortable with inappropriate behavior?" Kelly considered the question carefully before responding. "Honestly? There were a few times when your comments about women seemed a little over the line, but I attributed it to military humor. Looking back, maybe I should have said something." The admission was like a knife to Jake's chest. If Kelly, one of his closest friends, had noticed problematic behavior, then maybe the pattern the investigators had identified was real. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because you're a good Marine and a good friend, and I didn't want to create problems over what seemed like minor issues." "But, Jake, minor issues can become major problems if they're not addressed." Kelly sat down across from Jake's desk. "I've been thinking about this since the investigation started. Military culture has allowed certain behaviors to slide for too long. Maybe what's happening to you is part of a necessary change." Jake finished packing in silence, processing Kelly's words. The idea that his behavior had been problematic for years without his awareness was deeply troubling. It forced him to question not just his actions, but his entire understanding of appropriate social interaction. As Jake prepared to leave the office for the last time, First Sergeant Martinez appeared in the doorway. "Morrison, before you go, I want you to know that your service record up to this point has been exemplary. Whatever happens with the court-martial, don't let this mistake define your entire military career." The kindness in Martinez's voice was almost overwhelming. Jake had expected anger and disappointment from his leadership, but instead he was receiving support and understanding. "First Sergeant, I keep trying to understand how I got to this point. How did I become someone who would harass a flag officer in a bar?" Martinez leaned against the doorframe. "Morrison, I've been in the Corps for 22 years, and I've seen good Marines make terrible decisions. Sometimes it's alcohol, sometimes it's stress, sometimes it's just a moment of poor judgment. The key is learning from the mistake and becoming a better person." As Jake walked across the base carrying his belongings, he reflected on the conversation with Martinez. The possibility of becoming a better person seemed remote when his entire world was collapsing, but perhaps that was exactly when personal growth was most necessary. The next morning, Jake reported to Special Processing Company, a collection of buildings that housed Marines in various states of transition. Some were awaiting medical discharge, others were processing out after completing their service, and a few, like Jake, were waiting for legal proceedings to determine their fate. The commanding officer of Special Processing Company was Major Patricia Stevens, a no-nonsense officer who had seen every type of administrative challenge the Marine Corps could present. "Sergeant Morrison, welcome to Special Processing Company. I want to be clear about expectations here. You're not on vacation, you're not being punished beyond the legal proceedings you're already facing, and you're not here to cause problems for my other Marines." Jake stood at attention as Major Stevens outlined his new responsibilities. "You'll be assigned to the base legal office as an administrative assistant. Your job is to help with filing, data entry, and other clerical tasks. You'll work regular hours, maintain military appearance standards, and conduct yourself in a manner befitting a Marine, regardless of the circumstances that brought you here." The assignment to work in the legal office felt like cosmic irony. Jake would be spending his days surrounded by the very system that was prosecuting him. But perhaps that proximity would help him understand the process and prepare for what was coming. As Jake settled into his new routine at Special Processing Company, he began to realize that the hardest part of his situation wasn't the legal consequences or the damage to his career. The hardest part was accepting that he might not be the person he thought he was, and that changing that person would require more than just surviving a court-martial. 2 weeks into his assignment at the base legal office, Jake had settled into a routine of quiet efficiency and careful self-reflection. His work consisted mainly of filing court documents, organizing case files, and maintaining legal databases. The irony of working surrounded by military law while facing his own legal proceedings was not lost on him, but he found the environment oddly comforting in its predictability. Captain Walsh had been meeting with Jake twice weekly to prepare for the upcoming court-martial. During these sessions, she had helped him understand not just the legal process, but the broader implications of his case for military culture and leadership standards. Sergeant Morrison, Walsh said during one of their sessions, "I need you to understand that your case is being watched at very high levels of command. The Marine Corps is using it to send a message about accountability and standards of behavior." Jake nodded, having come to accept that he had become an example rather than just a defendant. "Captain, I've been thinking a lot about the allegations from other women. I remember those interactions differently, but I'm beginning to understand that my perception of what happened isn't what matters most." Walsh leaned forward with interest. This was the first time Jake had acknowledged the broader pattern of behavior rather than focusing solely on the incident with Admiral Wells. "Tell me more about that realization." Jake had spent many sleepless nights replaying conversations and interactions from the past few years, seeing them through the lens of the women's perspectives rather than his own intentions. "I think I confused being friendly with being appropriate. I made comments about women's appearances because I thought I was being complimentary, not because I wanted to make them uncomfortable. But the impact of my words was harassment, regardless of my intentions." This acknowledgement represented a significant shift in Jake's thinking. For weeks, he had maintained that the allegations were exaggerated or misunderstood. Now he was beginning to accept responsibility not just for his actions, but for their effects on others. "That's an important insight, Sergeant Morrison. The question now is how we present this understanding to the court-martial panel in a way that demonstrates genuine remorse and personal growth." The legal strategy had evolved as Jake's understanding of his situation deepened. Rather than fighting the charges or minimizing his actions, Walsh recommended an approach centered on accepting responsibility and demonstrating commitment to change. 3 days later, Jake received an unexpected visitor. Staff Sergeant Kelly Rodriguez appeared in the legal office during lunch break, carrying a folder and wearing an expression Jake couldn't read. "Kelly, what brings you here?" Kelly looked around the office to make sure they were alone before responding. "Jake, I need to tell you something, and you're not going to like it." Jake felt his stomach tighten. More bad news seemed to arrive weekly, and he had learned to brace himself for each revelation. "I've been called to testify at your court-martial. Not as a character witness for you, but as a witness regarding your pattern of behavior with female Marines." The news hit Jake like a physical blow. Kelly was one of his closest friends, someone he had trusted and confided in for years. The idea that she would be testifying against him felt like a betrayal. "Kelly, what are you going to say?" Kelly opened the folder and pulled out a legal document. "I'm going to tell the truth about conversations we've had over the years. Comments you made about female Marines, jokes you thought were funny, attitudes you expressed about women in the military. I don't want to hurt you, Jake, but I can't lie under oath." Jake stared at the document in Kelly's hands, realizing that his own words and attitudes were being used to build the case against him. "What kind of comments are you talking about?" Kelly's expression was sad as she responded. "Jake, you used to rate the attractiveness of female Marines during unit formations. You made jokes about women not belonging in combat roles. You told me that you thought female Marines were either too masculine or too emotional to be effective leaders. You said those things to me because you trusted me, and you thought I agreed with you." Each example felt like a hammer blow. Jake remembered some of those conversations, but, in his memory, they had been casual observations between friends, not evidence of a pattern of disrespect toward women. "Kelly, I never thought those comments were harmful. I was just talking." "That's exactly the problem, Jake. You never thought about how harmful they were, because you never considered the perspective of the women you were talking about. Your just talking created an environment where female Marines felt judged, objectified, and unwelcome." Kelly sat down across from Jake, her expression softening slightly. "Jake, I want you to know that I don't hate you, and I don't want to see your life destroyed. But I also can't pretend that your attitudes toward women haven't been problematic for years. Maybe this court-martial is the wake-up call you needed." After Kelly left, Jake sat in the empty legal office, processing the conversation and its implications for his case. His defense strategy had been built around the premise that the incident with Admiral Wells was an aberration, a single night of poor judgment that didn't reflect his true character. Now it was becoming clear that the prosecution would present evidence of a much more systematic problem. That evening, Jake called Captain Walsh to discuss the development. "Captain, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez visited me today. She's going to testify about comments I made over the years about female Marines. Comments that I thought were private conversations between friends." Walsh was silent for a moment before responding. "Sergeant Morrison, this changes our defense strategy significantly. We can no longer argue that your behavior was an isolated incident. We need to focus entirely on demonstrating that you understand the seriousness of your actions and are committed to changing." The shift in strategy felt like an admission of defeat, but Jake was beginning to understand that winning the court-martial was less important than winning the battle with himself. 2 weeks later, Jake's court-martial began. The proceedings took place in a formal courtroom on base, with a panel of 5 officers serving as judge and jury. The trial counsel, Major Amanda Foster, was a seasoned military prosecutor with a reputation for thorough preparation and effective presentation. Jake sat beside Captain Walsh at the defense table, wearing his dress blue uniform with ribbons and medals that now felt like artifacts from a different life. Across the aisle, he could see several witnesses waiting to testify, including Kelly Rodriguez and the other Marines who had reported his inappropriate behavior. Major Foster's opening statement was devastating in its clarity. "Members of the panel, the evidence will show that Sergeant Morrison engaged in a pattern of sexual harassment and inappropriate behavior toward female service members over a period of several years, culminating in his harassment of Rear Admiral Catherine Wells on the evening of November 15. Foster outlined the prosecution's case methodically, describing each incident and allegation with precise detail. She painted a picture of a Marine who had used his rank and position to make female service members uncomfortable and who had shown a consistent disregard for appropriate professional boundaries. Captain Walsh's opening statement took a different approach. "Members of the panel, Sergeant Morrison stands before you today not to deny his actions, but to accept responsibility for them. What you will hear during this trial is the story of a Marine who lost his way and is working to find it again." The prosecution's case unfolded over 3 days. Lance Corporal Jennifer Kim testified about unwelcome comments and persistent requests for dates. Corporal Lisa Rodriguez described feeling cornered and intimidated by Jake's behavior in the mess hall. Base Library employee Maria Santos explained how Jake's frequent visits had made her uncomfortable and interfered with her work. Kelly Rodriguez's testimony was particularly difficult for Jake to hear. She described years of conversations in which Jake had expressed dismissive attitudes toward female Marines and made inappropriate comments about their appearance and capabilities. "The defendant told me on multiple occasions that he believed women were natural targets for male attention and that they shouldn't complain when Marines showed interest in them," Kelly testified. "He said that women who joined the military should expect to deal with male behavior and that filing complaints was weak." Jake barely recognized the person Kelly was describing, but he couldn't deny that the words were his. Hearing his own attitudes reflected back through testimony forced him to confront the reality of how his thinking had affected others. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when Admiral Wells testified. Jake had not seen her since that night at Murphy's Bar, and her presence in the courtroom was commanding. She wore her service dress blue uniform with the 2 stars of her rank clearly visible. "On the evening of November 15, I went to Murphy's Bar for a quiet drink after a long day of meetings," Admiral Wells testified. "I was approached by the defendant, who ignored my repeated requests to be left alone and made inappropriate comments about my appearance and his belief that his military service entitled him to my attention." Admiral Wells spoke with the calm authority of someone accustomed to command, but Jake could see the impact his behavior had had on her. "What troubled me most was not just the defendant's behavior toward me, but his apparent belief that such behavior was acceptable. His attitude suggested that he had acted this way before and would likely act this way again." During cross-examination, Captain Walsh tried to establish that Admiral Wells had not identified herself as a flag officer, but the Admiral's response was devastating. "Counselor, my rank should have been irrelevant. Every person, regardless of their position, has the right to be treated with respect and dignity. The defendant's behavior would have been inappropriate whether I was an admiral or a private citizen." On the final day of testimony, Jake took the stand in his own defense. Captain Walsh had prepared him extensively for this moment, but nothing could have prepared him for the emotional weight of publicly acknowledging his failures. "Members of the panel," Jake began, his voice steady despite his nervousness, "I stand before you today to accept full responsibility for my actions and to acknowledge that I have failed to live up to the standards expected of a Marine leader." Jake described his behavior at Murphy's Bar in detail, not minimizing or excusing his actions but acknowledging their impact on Admiral Wells and others. "I cannot change what I did that night or in the years leading up to it, but I can commit to becoming a better person and a better Marine. I have learned that intent doesn't matter if the impact is harmful, and I have learned that my attitudes toward women were wrong and damaging." During cross-examination, Major Foster pressed Jake about his pattern of behavior and his understanding of why multiple women had come forward with allegations. "Sergeant Morrison, these witnesses have described years of inappropriate behavior. Do you expect this panel to believe that you suddenly developed insight into your actions only after being caught?" Jake took a moment to consider his response carefully. "Major, I think I've been avoiding difficult truths about myself for years. It took this investigation and these testimonies for me to understand how my behavior affected others. I'm ashamed that it took legal consequences to make me examine my attitudes and actions." The closing arguments summarized the positions both sides had established throughout the trial. Major Foster argued that Jake's behavior represented a systematic disregard for the rights and dignity of female service members and that significant consequences were necessary to deter similar behavior by others. Captain Walsh argued that while Jake's actions were inexcusable, his acceptance of responsibility and commitment to change demonstrated that he could be rehabilitated rather than simply punished. After deliberating for 6 hours, the panel returned with their verdict. Jake stood at attention as the president of the panel read the findings. "Sergeant Morrison, this panel finds you guilty of sexual harassment under Article 120 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice and guilty of conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline under Article 134. The words carried the weight of finality. Jake had known this moment was coming, but hearing the guilty verdict still felt like a physical blow. The sentencing phase began immediately. Character witnesses testified on Jake's behalf, including his former commanding officers and Marines who had served under his leadership. They painted a picture of a competent leader and dedicated Marine whose recent behavior was inconsistent with his previous service record. However, the weight of the evidence and the seriousness of the charges influenced the panel's decision. After 2 hours of deliberation, they announced Jake's sentence: reduction in rank to Lance Corporal, forfeiture of all pay and allowances for 6 months, and discharge from the Marine Corps with a general discharge under other than honorable conditions. The sentence meant the end of Jake's military career. After 18 years of service, he would leave the Marine Corps without the honor and benefits typically accorded to retiring service members. But, as Jake listened to the sentence, he felt something unexpected: relief. The trial was over, the consequences were clear, and now he could begin the work of rebuilding his life and his character. The man who had walked into Murphy's Bar 3 months earlier was gone, replaced by someone who understood the weight of his actions and the necessity of change. As Jake left the courtroom for the final time, Admiral Wells approached him. Her expression was serious but not unkind. "Sergeant Morrison, I want you to know that I took no pleasure in these proceedings. However, I hope that you and others will learn from this experience that accountability and respect are not optional in military service." Jake came to attention and responded formally. "Ma'am, I understand that my actions were inexcusable, and I accept full responsibility for the consequences. I hope that my case will help create a better environment for all service members." Admiral Wells nodded and walked away, leaving Jake to contemplate the future he would have to build outside the only career he had ever known. 6 weeks later, Jake Morrison walked out of Camp Pendleton as a civilian for the first time in 18 years. He carried a single duffel bag and discharge papers that would forever mark his military service as incomplete and unsatisfactory. The Marine he had been was gone, but the man he was becoming had learned lessons about respect, accountability, and personal growth that would shape the rest of his life. The road ahead was uncertain and challenging, but Jake faced it with a clear understanding of who he had been and a commitment to becoming someone better. The uniform was gone, but the work of redemption was just beginning.